day participants, hello again from Manila. So it is 3:10 and we are starting our EMI Urban Resilience Webinar Series. So thank you for joining us today. So I am Catherine and with me is Michael. We also joining us today are also here is Harry, Kent, and Arnie. And of course, our expert, attorney Anne Rodel Siders, is also live on chat. Yeah. So thank you for joining us today.
To give you some background on our expert, Siders is an interdisciplinary scientist and lawyer who obtained a bachelor's degree in human evolutionary biology and a doctor of jurisprudence both from Harvard University. Currently, she is a PhD candidate in environment and resources at Stanford University. Previously, she worked as a postdoctoral research scholar at the Center of Climate Change Law in Columbia University and as a presidential management fellow with the US Navy. Her work is geographically diverse, with her projects in the Arctic, Europe, United States, and Southeast Asia.
Okay, so excited. Let's start. Let's begin. So before we officially begin the session, just some reminders. If you haven't downloaded the module yet, the link will be found in the chat box, and I think it has already been sent. Yes, it's already been sent to the participants. So click that link to download the modules.
Our webinar will also run for an hour, with the lecture on nature-based strategies for flood defense lasting for 35 minutes. Once the lecture ends, we will then proceed to a short break and then a live Q&A portion for 15 minutes.
Okay, so you can share your thoughts and create a discussion using the chat box. So at any point in time, you can type your question there. But also, there will be a live Q&A portion after the video lecture. So you can also put your questions once we get to the Q&A portion. Okay, so your microphones will be temporarily muted so it doesn't interfere with the connection. We will enable your microphones once the live question answer portion begins.
We're now playing the video.
Enjoy.
Enjoy.
Do you want me to press this on? Where is the module? Is it a link? No, naka-ano ako. Hindi nagpa-play sa amin. Ako, sa akin hindi nagpa-play. Ha?
Ikaw nakikita.
Ako yung nakikita niya. Why do you keep going out? Oh, why do you keep on going out? You're the host. Mm. You want to put some tea?
Uh, Sorry for the late participants. We're now about to share the video to you guys. Enjoy the video.
This force of the impact
experiencing you're experiencing technical difficulties right now, please wait for a while. Please wait for until less than 10 minutes, and we'll play the video again. Thank you.
question and answer button on the left-hand side of your Google Hangouts screen. Okay, to get started, let's look at why coastal flood defense is so important. Climate change is occurring at an unprecedented rate, and one of the most certain consequences of climate change is sea level rise. This graph you see is based on estimates from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and it shows historic sea levels, which you can see.
Do I enlarge this?
Hi, my name is Ann Siders. I'll be hosting a webinar session on nature-based strategies for coastal flood mitigation as part of the Earthquakes and Megacity Initiatives webinar series. In the session, I'll be providing an introduction to nature-based strategies and some examples of when and where they can be used most effectively. In particular, I'll be discussing how climate change. Hi, my name is Ann Siders. I'll be hosting a webinar session on nature-based strategies for coastal flood mitigation as part of the Earthquakes and Megacity Initiatives webinar series. In the session, I'll be providing an introduction to nature-based strategies and some examples of when and where they can be used most effectively. In particular, I'll be discussing how climate change, rising sea levels, and changing storm patterns may make nature-based strategies an effective long-term approach. I'll be comparing nature-based strategies with structural infrastructure, also known as green and gray infrastructure, and be providing examples of where these strategies have been used most effectively. I'll also introduce layered and mixed defense strategies. We'll have a live question and answer session so that you can ask and get specific feedback and learn from your peers. If you have any questions during the lecture, please submit them using the question and answer button on the left-hand side of your Google Hangouts screen. Okay, to get started, let's look at why coastal flood defense is so important. Climate change is occurring at an unprecedented rate, and one of the most certain consequences of climate change is sea level rise. This graph you see is based on estimates from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and the potential for much faster, much more drastic sea level rise in the future, depending on the various greenhouse gas emission scenarios. We could see anywhere from 1 foot to 1 meter of sea level rise globally. In some localities, we'll see even greater sea level rise due to wind and local ocean circulation patterns. Sea a challenge, not severe, as warming oceans provide more energy to storm systems. This combination of higher sea levels and stronger storms places coastal cities and communities at risk of higher storm surge. Roughly a quarter of the world's population lives along the coasts, including 12 of the world's 16, also central to our economic OECD. Cities around the world are projected to be at risk from coastal flooding and storm surge events by as soon as 2070. Some of these areas have long faced risks from hurricanes and coastal flooding, but for others it's a new threat. And for all of them, they're going to have to find new ways of defending their coasts against this increased risk. In October 2012, a city that rarely faces hurricane threats, the storm tore down trees, destroyed buildings and homes, flooded subways and tunnels, wreaking havoc with transportation. It flooded electrical substations, plunging great swaths of the city into darkness. Hospitals had to evacuate patients that were on life support when their generators failed. A fire broke out after the storm, and houses that had survived the initial storm were actually burned to the ground. They were preparing not just for another important lessons. The flood walls that they had built to protect their substations and homes had been breached by waves that were much higher than had previously been experienced. Neighborhoods along the coast that had invested in dune restoration suffered far less damage than those without. For example, Bradley Beach suffered only $2 to $3 million in damage, far less than the $200 million in damage suffered by neighboring Long Beach that had decided against those protective dunes. The New York story is certainly not the most dramatic that we could pick worldwide. It hit home for me because I was living in New York City at the time and worked afterwards with city and local governments to help rebuild efforts that would prepare not just for another Sandy, but for future storms that might even be worse as they're affected by climate change. I'm sure everyone attending today's webinar has their own story, some far worse than that experienced in New York. And this is the kind of disaster that we want to talk about today. How do we build now to prevent this and far worse from happening in the future? Hi, my name is Ann Siders. I'll be hosting the webinar session on nature-based strategies for coastal flood mitigation as part of the Earthquakes and Megacity Initiatives webinar series. In the session, I'll be providing an introduction to nature-based strategies and some examples of when and where they can be used most effectively. In particular, I'll be discussing how climate change, rising sea levels, and changing storm patterns may make nature-based strategies an effective long-term approach. I'll be comparing nature-based strategies with structural infrastructure, also known as green and gray infrastructure, and be providing examples of where these strategies have been used most effectively. I'll also introduce layered and mixed effect strategies. We'll have a live question and answer session, so that you can ask and get specific feedback and learn from your peers. If you have any questions during the lecture, please submit them using the question and answer button on the left-hand side of your Google Hangouts screen. Okay, to get started, let's look at why coastal flood defense is so important. Climate change is occurring at an unprecedented rate, and one of the most certain consequences of climate change is sea level rise. This graph you see is based on estimates from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and it shows historic sea levels, which you can see gradually increasing from 1700 to 2000, and the potential for much faster, much more drastic sea level rise in the future, depending on the various greenhouse gas emission scenarios. We could see anywhere from 1 foot to 1 meter of sea level rise globally. In some localities, we'll see even greater sea level rise due to wind and local ocean circulation patterns. Sea level rise is a major challenge, not only in its own right, but also in the way that it combines with coastal storms, which may also become stronger and more severe as warming oceans provide more energy to storm systems. This combination of higher sea levels and stronger storms places coastal cities and communities at risk of higher storm surge. Roughly a quarter of the world's population lives along the coasts, including 12 of the world's 16 megacities. The coasts are also central to our economic development through fishing and port access. And as you can see in this graphic from the OECD, cities around the world are projected to be at risk from coastal flooding and storm surge events by as soon as 2070. Some of these areas have long faced risks from hurricanes and coastal flooding, but for others it's a new threat. And for all of them, they're going to have to find new ways of defending their coasts against this increased risk. In October 2012, a city that rarely faces hurricane threats. The storm tore down trees, destroyed buildings and homes, flooded subways and tunnels, wreaking havoc with transportation. It flooded electrical substations, plunging great swaths of the city into darkness. Hospitals had to evacuate patients that were on life support when their generators failed. A fire broke out after the storm, and houses that had survived the initial storm were actually burned to the ground. They were preparing not just for another important lessons. The flood walls that they had built to protect their substations and homes had been breached by waves that were much higher than had previously been experienced. Neighborhoods along the coast that had invested in dune restoration suffered far less damage than those without. For example, Bradley Beach suffered only $2 to $3 million in damage, far less than the $200 million in damage suffered by neighboring Long Beach that had decided against those protective dunes. The New York story is certainly not the most dramatic that we could pick worldwide. It hit home for me because I was living in New York City at the time and worked afterwards with city and local governments to help rebuild efforts that would prepare not just for another Sandy, but for future storms that might even be worse as they're affected by climate change. I'm sure everyone attending today's webinar has their own story, some far worse than that experienced in New York. And this is the kind of disaster that we want to talk about today. How do we build now to prevent this and far worse from happening in the future? Before we get into solutions, I want to back up for a moment and talk about floods and adaptation responses. There are several different types of floods. Coastal flooding can be either slow due to sea level rise or coastal erosion. As the waters rise and the beach wears away, coastal structures become more and more exposed to the rising tides of the ocean. It can also be fast due to storm surge or tsunamis. Flooding from storm surge and tsunamis are particularly dangerous because of the wave action. Buildings are exposed not only to the rising waters, but also the actual force of the waves. And this force of the impact can knock down buildings and create dangerous rubble that can then be washed through communities and cause additional damage. Fluvial or riverine flooding occurs when a river overflows its banks. Fluvial or rain flooding is caused when heavy rainfall cannot be absorbed or drained away. This occurs frequently in urban areas where concrete roads and buildings prevent rain from being soaked into the soil. Although new development, green roofs, pervious sidewalks, and larger green spaces can help address this kind of flooding. This is particularly dangerous when there's heavy rainfall, lots of rain in a very short time period, and there's not enough time for the water to be absorbed and it washes away. This can also contribute to erosion and cause major issues in agricultural regions. Last one, groundwater. Groundwater flooding is when the groundwater table actually rises up through the sediment. This can also be caused by heavy rainfall, but it usually builds up over time as a series of heavy rainfalls saturate the ground and cause the rising waters. Today, we'll be talking primarily about the coastal and the riverine flooding. This could also apply to pluvial and groundwater flooding. Those will have slightly different strategies in how you look at drainage as opposed to protect waters. So, what are our adaptation strategies? There are three main adaptation approaches: to protect, to accommodate, or to retreat. Protection is done to actually prevent the water from reaching the vulnerable structures. This can be hard or soft armoring. Accommodation is when we modify structures and our land use patterns to allow the flooding to occur, but in a way that doesn't provide damage or affect the way that we live our lives. The example here is elevating a house. The house is still in its area, the water can still come towards the house, but it doesn't cause damage because the water simply washes underneath the house. And the last one, retreat, is to actually move houses or other structures away from the source of the flooding, so away from the vulnerable coastline, away from the riverbanks. Today we'll be focusing on this protection option. There's some overlap among the three strategies, and a truly comprehensive flood defense strategy will need to incorporate all three approaches. So we're going to isolate and just look at the protection, the hard and soft options here, but I want to put it in the larger context of adaptation towards flood strategies. So if we've chosen to protect a strategy against coastal and riverine flooding, what kind of options do we have? One way that we often divide up protection strategies is into hard and soft. It's also called gray armoring, stone on gray materials. These are man-made structures that physically block waves, water, and current from reaching the shoreline or the coastal structures. Soft armoring, or green armoring, because it relies often on plants and organic material. is based on the ability of the natural shoreline to buffer against floodwaters. Soft armoring uses organic materials to strengthen the shoreline against erosion and against the wave action, but it allows waves and tidal action to reach the shoreline and allows the shoreline to naturally reshape itself in an ongoing process. There's also SAGE approaches, that's so-called because it combines green and gray flood defenses. I'll talk a little bit about these at the end as they've become increasingly popular. So today, the title of this talk is Nature-Based Strategies to Flood Defense. And so here, what I want to focus on are these soft armoring strategies. And why would we use soft armoring? But to answer that question, I really need to look at why don't we want to use hard armoring? Because a lot of the answer that pushes us towards soft armoring is in recognizing the downsides of hard armoring. There are many different types of hard armoring. Here are just a few that are illustrated to give you an idea of what we're talking about. Seawalls are high structures that prevent waves line. Bulkhead retaining walls are built to prevent the soil from eroding, where they look very similar to seawalls. Groins are actually built perpendicularly to the shoreline. They capture sediment up and down the shore to prevent the natural wave action from hitting the shore. Revetments or riprap, depending just on what material is used, they have a different name. They're usually walls or small stones that prevent soil erosion and limit the wave action from hitting the soil and causing more erosion. Levees are built-up structures that follow the shape of the waterway and they channel water into a desired direction, so away from the houses and towards other bodies of water or towards floodable areas. Breakwaters are structures that are located offshore and are actually designed to break up the wave energy. Some of you are probably very familiar with these strategies and know that I'm giving you very simplified definitions of them. But I just want to show some illustrations of what hard armoring looks like. These structures can be very effective at protecting coastal properties, particularly in the short term, in the annual or decadal time period. But they have long-term consequences, and that's what we're going to talk about. I'll go through each of these in more detail. But the downsides of hard armoring are they're expensive, they cause damage to neighboring properties, they cause damage to the ecosystems, they can cause long-term beach erosion and beach loss, and then there's a tendency to rely on them and to increase your building in vulnerable areas after you rely on the hard armoring that's in place. Let's talk about expensive. Hard armoring is expensive. These structures are expensive to build, to maintain, and as sea levels rise, they're increasingly expensive to raise in height down the road. As sea level increases, you need your seawall to increase in height in order to handle the higher elevation of the water. As an example of the kind of numbers I'm talking about, in California, from 1985 to 1990, they installed 45 miles of armoring at an average cost of $1,500 per foot, for a total of $60 million a year just to install armoring. One seawall, just in Seattle, Washington, is currently being built at a cost of $400 million. They're expensive to maintain. In Massachusetts, 80% of the coastal structures have already outlived their 50-year lifespan. And I want to emphasize that 50-year lifespan, meaning that these structures have to be rebuilt every 50 years. That may sound like a long time, but when you're building infrastructure along the coast, a hotel or a house, do you expect to live there for at least 50 to 100 years? You're going to have to rebuild the seawall as often as you rebuild the house. In Massachusetts, of these 80% of their coastal structures, 85% of them have gone unrepaired in the last 50 years. So they need to spend an estimated $30 million a year for the next 20 years just to make their high priority fixes. So we're talking $60 million a year to install your armoring, another $30 million a year to maintain it. These costs can add up. And certainly they're very minimal compared to the billions of dollars of damage that I talked about from Hurricane Sandy in New York. So there is a cost-benefit analysis there that hard armoring can benefit. And so hard armoring may make sense in very rich areas or in areas where the coastal structures are extremely valuable. where that cost-benefit analysis comes out in favor of the hard armoring. But in areas that are less built up or that don't have as expensive a coastal infrastructure, it doesn't make financial sense to spend this kind of money on hard coastal armoring. So something to keep in mind about where do we want hard armoring and where do we want some alternatives like soft armoring. The next two issues I talked about, the downsides of hard armoring, were damage. Hard armoring affects the way that wave action hits the shore. That's the purpose of hard armoring, is to change the way that wave action works. One of the downsides is that hard armoring actually increases the wave action on neighboring shorelines. So if your neighbor has a wall and you do not, your property actually sees increased erosion and damage from the waves, as you can see in this photo from Fish and Wildlife Services. The property of the seawall has been protected, but the one next to it has actually experienced worse erosion because of the neighboring seawall. You can see this in the diagram to the bottom left as well. As a result of this, hard armoring needs to be undertaken as a whole region approach. It can't be taken piecemeal, or else you'll get these pockets of protected and unprotected areas. This kind of coordination has also a substantial cost. And if you have to do armoring not bit by bit, but all at once, that can make a substantial financial layout and capital at one time. It also means that your entire coastline in a region becomes walled off. So from an aesthetic, from a recreational, or from an ecological standpoint, you have a whole coastline that is now coated in cement. And this gets into the next suggestion, the one that talks about the damage to ecosystem. Hard armoring harms the ecology of the local beach. When the armoring is put in place, it disrupts the natural flow of sediment, of sand, and nutrients, as well as the natural behavior of fish, birds, and other organisms that live in the area. Hard armoring can also provide a home to some invasive species that are accustomed to living on concrete and other types of unnatural substances. The environmental harms are often considered far less important than protecting the safety of coastal communities and their homes and businesses, and that's understandable. However, if coastal communities are relying on fishing or ecotourism or scuba diving for their income, then disruption to local ecology can really play an extreme detriment to their long-term benefit. The most extreme type of ecosystem damage that we can see is beach loss. In this, hard armoring causes long-term beach first narrowing and then beach loss entirely. In a normal beach situation, as sea levels rise or storm waves wash the system, some sand is lost, and the entire beach ecosystem simply shifts inland. This natural fluctuation has occurred for thousands of years, with beaches reshaping themselves according to the wave and the current dynamics. However, when we build a hard armoring system, such as a revetment or a seawall, we stop this natural cycle. The sea levels still continue to rise, and the beach and sand that's on the water side of the wall continues to erode. But the beach is not able to migrate inland. So eventually the water comes directly up to the seawall, and the beach, along with its ecosystem, along with all of its recreational opportunities, is gone. You see this pattern in Hawaii, where 25% of the beaches on the island of Oahu and 30% on Maui have experienced beach narrowing due to coastal protection. As you can see in the photo, water levels come right up to the protective wall at high tide. And these water levels are continuing to rise, leaving less and less beach for the enjoyment of tourists. Ecologically, this is important to the species of Hawaiian monk seal and green sea turtle that use Hawaii beaches to raise their pups and hatch their eggs. This is also extremely important, as you can imagine, to the state's $11.4 billion tourism industry. What tourist goes to a beach destination that has no beaches? Who surfs at a beach with walls that block the surf action? Who scuba dives in an area where the wildlife is gone? So protecting the beaches can have an important effect on the local ecology, on the property values. It can also have an important effect on the community character of their location. Are they a beach community? Or are they a community who has water coming up to concrete walls that prevents them from actually accessing the ocean? Lastly, but in some ways the most important though, When you build seawalls and hard armoring structures, people rely on them. As the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction said, protective works have a tendency to increase the level of development in flood-prone areas, as the assumption is made that it is now safe to build and to invest in those areas that are protected. However, it must be recognized that at some point in the future, the design event will likely be exceeded and catastrophic damages will result. Even the best designed wall will eventually be exceeded. This is what we saw in New Orleans, this is what we saw in Japan, this is what we've seen in New York, this is what we saw in the Netherlands. We've seen this that when we build these levees, these walls, these systems to keep the water out, eventually the water gets in. And the more we build up behind the walls, the more people and the more infrastructure we place at risk. When a wall is built, people think that means the area is safe, and so they build more and more. Building a wall also makes it really difficult to switch strategies at a later date. We're going to have those three strategies of protecting, accommodating, and retreating. Once you've built a wall, once you've dedicated and you've put in the infrastructure and the financial resources to protect that area, you're locked into rebuilding and maintaining the wall for the future. It's very difficult to suddenly look at an area that has built up and become more and more dense with more valuable infrastructure and greater population density and to say, now we're going to stop protecting, now we're going to accommodate, and now we're going to retreat. So putting in that initial decision to protect that area can lock you into that into the future. It will do one of the most graphic illustrations of this type of reliance occurred in Japan with Daiichi and Daini nuclear power plants. Water is overtopped for flood walls. The designers hadn't imagined that water could come that high, so they haven't taken any additional steps to protect themselves inside landward. Of the flood walls. So once the water got over the flood walls, it was able to disable generators that were crucial to maintaining the nuclear power plant's cooling systems during shutdown. The cooling systems therefore malfunction, causing overheating and partial fuel meltdowns, all because the power plant operators had assumed that the walls would protect them and had designed accordingly. So if we want to avoid these harms, the expense, the damage to the environment, the potential for harmful reliance, the loss of beaches, and yet protect our coastal investment and our coastal communities, what kind of flood defenses can we pursue? This is where the soft armoring, this is where the nature-based flood solutions come in. Again, there are many different kinds of soft armoring. This diagram by NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration in the United States, organizes them based on the part of the shoreline where it can be placed. But this can also be used in combination in a layered defense approach. In the upland area, that closest to dry land, planting of vegetation such as trees and grasses with long roots can stabilize the soil to minimize erosion and to filter runoff. Sandfill can also be used to create a gentle bank slope that dissipates the wave energy to a storm surge that hits the land. Planting slopes of vegetation further prevents erosion of those bank slopes and further strengthens them against wave action. In the coastal wetlands and the beach strand, that middle section, the wetlands and marshes dissipate wave energy. They filter runoff and they improve wildlife habitat. Mangrove trees can stabilize the shoreline, trap sediment and nutrients, and dissipate wave energy. Logs or logs that are made of biodegradable coconut fiber and netting can be used to stabilize slopes and minimize erosion. Matting made of fibers can also minimize sediment loss and trap sediment. In the subtidal waters, living breakwaters can be placed parallel to the shore to dissipate the wave energy. They also provide habitat for local ecosystems and erosion control. They can be made of rocks or oyster colonies or entirely of reef-building oysters. They also create coral areas near the shoreline that can be planted with aquatic vegetation and marsh grasses to further help against erosion and wave action. We'll walk through a few of these commonly used soft armoring strategies to identify the pros and cons of each approach, as well as some characteristics of why they can be best used. The pros and cons are drawn from a panel of experts who work with the Environmental Defense Fund in the United States to identify the current state of knowledge about the soft armoring strategies. Their full report is called The Performance of Natural Infrastructure for Coastal Risk Reduction, and it can be found online. To start, beach nourishment. In this strategy, we draw sand, often from offshore sources, to build back eroded beaches. It's a temporary solution to coastal erosion. Beach erosion can help break offshore waves, reduce wave energy, and protect downrift beaches by providing an increased source of sand that's naturally redistributed along the coast. Sand relocated to this beach will be distributed by natural wave action, so the beach will have to be re-nourished at regular intervals. This may be expensive, and they also remove sand from offshore locations, which can change the ecosystem and the shoreline profile. Also, beach nourishment needs space, so it's best used in places where an existing beach has a wide profile, and in areas where there's a local source of sand, so that the cost of maintenance is reduced. Related is vegetated dunes. This can refer either to a project to plant vegetation on top of the dunes, or a project that would form new dunes in an area that hasn't had them. Vegetated dunes are beneficial because they break offshore waves, reduce wave energy, and provide a barrier between waves and coastal buildings. Unclear how long-term the strategy is. Again, this depends on particular certification, particular water quality in the area if we continue to use the strategy. Remember, for suppressive change to be effective, effective at reducing wave energy and height. Their root systems are very strong and they capture sediment and debris, which helps the mangroves to grow in response to sea level rise. So they're continually adapting to their sea level rise, like seawall that is continually elevating itself. Mangroves are particularly effective in periods for fast-moving storms. However, it takes a really long time for a mangrove forest to be large and strong enough to provide effective protection. How long and how large the forest needs to be is not exactly known. This is an area of ongoing research and we don't have enough information on to say, do you need 10 trees, 100 trees, 1,000 trees? Do they need enough ground for 10 years or 20? Unclear. One of the major challenges for soft is a qualitative information about how the strategies perform under different types of stress. This is an ongoing area of research with lab experience and real-life products being monitored right now to observe their performance metrics. There is evidence that these approaches are effective. The problem is we don't know exactly how effective. Soft armament also requires coordination and ecological area response. And many strategies are difficult to implement on a person-by-person basis. If you're going to put in a mangrove forest, you need a large swath of the coastline to agree to this strategy, along with patches of woodland and patches of open shoreline. Soft armament can also require greater communication with local residents and stakeholders, and they have to understand the benefits of soft armament. It's very easy to explain why building a wall will provide protection against flooding, but it can be very difficult to explain why building an oyster reef offshore might be a better long-term choice for a community because of the long-term economic and ecological benefits. These are not insurmountable challenges, but there are challenges that we need to be aware of when implementing these kinds of strategies. So to be prepared, have a communication strategy. So to go out and engage stakeholders and talk about the long-term benefits as well as the short-term protection. In the end, the best strategy will likely combine nature-based strategies with hard arming strategies, and will also include accommodation and retreat out, a low defense approach. Defenses can be layered out in space, with actual breakwaters, shore stabilization actions, tree planting, flood walls that are set back from the shore, and behind all these measures, houses that are elevated and that are relocated back from the coast to avoid damage from flood that overcome all of those layered defenses. The Netherlands is seen as one of the best prepared nations in the world for flooding, and we use hard arming solutions like levees and dikes. But beyond that, behind the levees and dikes, they also create natural buffers. They invest in plants that can go through water, so that when the flood does come over the levee and the dike, those plants still grow and can provide a controlled floodplain. They invest in floating houses, so that when the waters breach the levees, the houses and the people inside of them will still be safe. And in some areas, they are retreating from the shore entirely. They recognize that there are areas of their country that they simply cannot protect, no matter how hard they build the levee or the dike. And they are relocating people out of those areas and into safer areas. So the Netherlands is a great model for flood defense and coastal flood defense. But I want people to take away from this is that the Netherlands should not be seen simply as masters of making levees and dikes, but rather of having a holistic approach to having a layered defense that incorporates all of their available options into a layered defense that can protect against in space and also in time. Defenses can also be layered in time, so you have investment in, say, building dunes now, until the waters reach a certain level, at which point homes may be required to retreat from the coasts. So we have one strategy for now. We have a certain threshold that we've identified, and then we postal services and protection, but is this quantified exactly how much protection? It can be difficult to communicate with stakeholders unless you have a clear plan and a clear consultation and engagement process. So, in the end, a combination of these strategies is your best defense.
Nevertheless, it's now time for a Q&A portion. So please send in your questions into the chat box. We'll Hangouts. So we already have a first question, and it comes from Orange of New Zealand. Orange asks, when mainstreaming adaptation into policies, how do we convince governments that NPS are more cost-effective and resilient solutions? Orange asks, when mainstreaming adaptation into policies, how do we convince governments that NPS, or nature-based strategies, are more cost-effective and resilient solutions?
Hey, thanks for that question. Convincing governments to take on any new kind of policy is always a challenge. And nature-based strategies, as we were pointing out in the chat box, are a departure from traditional coastal defense practices. One way that we can convince governments to consider more nature-based strategies is by emphasizing all of the additional multiple benefits that you gain from having nature-based strategies. So the environmental benefits, the potential long-term economic benefits, such as we see from ecotourism. Also, now that climate change is becoming more of a driver of some of these decisions, pointing out that nature-based strategies are actually a long-term adaptation helps open up different sources of funding. And this can be an interesting way of trying to get governments, particularly in developing countries, on board, because they can apply for other grants from different sources than they would be able to for traditional hard solutions. So sometimes it's just a matter of being creative in how we try to sell the solution and how we get local people involved in it and inform them about the cost benefits so that they can pressure governments, and then about how we try to find creative funding solutions for these problems.
I hope that answers your question, Orange. Okay, for our next question, it comes from Vivian of Slovakia. Vivian asked, how do we communicate local residents about natural defense flood strategies? Like, I'll repeat the question again. The question comes from Vivian of Slovak Republic. Vivian asked, sorry, how do we communicate with local residents about natural flood defense strategies?
Will depend very much on what resources are available. In the United States, one solution that people often use is local town forums. So a lot of public government meetings are open to the public, so communicating to them through that means can be very effective. Also communicating in schools, so doing outreach at local school projects. In California, a number of areas have had success by actually getting local high schools involved, because the high school students, as they learn about nature-based strategies, they then go home and tell their parents about all the things that they're learning. So not only are the kids learning about the strategies and the long-term decisions, but they're going home and educating their parents. And so outreach at student level can be very effective in getting towards communities. But also doing it at the public decision-making level. So having the planning meetings open to the community to have them be able to come in and learn and also engage in that process. In general, more community engagement in those kind of decisions is beneficial for a lot of reasons, but particularly when you're trying a new thing like nature-based strategies. One other thing the US has found beneficial is in visualization. So in Monterey Bay, for example, the city of Monterey has been doing a lot of nature-based strategies. And one way they got the community on board was by doing visualization, actually getting graphic artists to create just images, big posters about what the city would look like if you had concrete, hard armoring walls, and what it would look like if you had nature-based strategies, the parks, the trees, the dune restoration. And being able to visually show residents what those two strategies look like and what the changes that they would make in their city. So very literally showing, do you want a concrete wall or do you want the lovely park? It makes it a lot easier for citizens to be able to at least understand the trade-off they're making there. And I know that simplifies the issue a lot, but sometimes that can be important.
Thank you for your answer, Siders. We now move on to the third question. Our third question comes from Cyril of France. Cyril asks, what kind of funding strategies are used to pay for natural defense strategies?
Oh no, missed a chunk of info. Okay.
The question again. Our question comes from Cyril of France. Cyril asks, what kind of funding strategies are used to pay for natural defense strategies? Cyril asks, what kind of funding strategies are used to pay for national defense strategy? Now, this is Sider's answer to your question, Cyril. I'll read it for her. Some strategies for communication that have worked in California, where I work now, are first, educate people during public planning meetings or town halls. Second, engaging high school or middle school students in beach projects. As the students learn, they go home and teach their parents. And third, coming up with visuals that show how traditional hard and nature-based strategies affect the beauty of the area. When you can show a resident that the difference between a concrete wall and a lovely park, it is a very, very visceral reaction. So I hope that answers your question, Cyril. Okay, so let's move on to our next question, our fourth question. It comes from Nasir of Lebanon. Okay, Nasir asks, are there particular laws or regulations we could use to promote national defense strategies?
Yes, definitely. Um, there are several ways to.
I'll be reading on behalf. Okay, let's just wait for the answer. Okay. I'll be reading on behalf of Siders again. Okay, this is the answer to your question, Nasir. Okay, yes, definitely. There are several ways to approach this. You could prevent homeowners from building seawalls or other hard armored structures. This forces them to find other solutions, and often they turn to nature-based strategies. You could provide financial incentives for nature-based strategies such as tax breaks. Okay, yes. I think the answer. Okay, so I hope that answers your question, Nasir. Let's move on to our fifth question. Okay, it comes from Nancy of India. Nancy asks, layer defense is an interesting strategy. Can you provide suggestions on how to implement this? know. Okay, so this is Sider's question. This is Sider's answer to your question, Nancy. I'll be reading it now. The Netherlands is probably the best example of where this has been done. We tend to think about the Netherlands for their dikes and levees, but as more they have levees and dikes, but behind the levees, they also have elevated buildings, or my favorite, buildings that float salt-resistant crops in areas that they will allow to flood. And some areas have been given up, and in some areas that have been given up, the government says these are too risky, and it does not allow building in those areas. Other places have nature-based strategies right along the coast. And then a hard seawall, maybe 30 meters or more back from the water. So if the floods get really high, the wall will help, but the beach is still allowed some natural movement. Okay. I hope that answers your question, Nancy. Okay, let's move. Okay, I hope that answers your question, Nancy. And okay, I hope that answers your question, Nancy. And let's move on to the next question. Okay, it comes from Pedro of Argentina. Pedro asks, in a coastal city where the natural environment is already degraded, is it still possible to consider nature-based strategies as flood defense? Sorry. Okay. So Cyrus has already given her answer in the chat box. I'll be reading it for everyone. Okay, so the answer to your question, Pedro, is this. Nature-based strategies can be posture of a solution in a city, but are unlikely to be the whole solution. For example, New York City is investing in seawalls and flood walls, but is also building also building a series of parks along the waterfront so that flood waters will be absorbed more in that space. In some ways, nature-based approaches here are much harder, as the built environment means people want a higher degree of more important. Providing green space, as in the New York example, is very beneficial for the city. Okay, I hope that answers your question, Pedro. Okay, this is our last question. Okay, for our final question, um, okay, it comes from John of Vanuatu. John asks, what is the best long-term flood defense strategy for small island nation states? Uh, Here's the answer to your question, John, according to Siders. For small island nation states, I think nature-based strategies coupled with flood-resistant buildings, for example, such as elevated, is the best strategy. So many small island nations have very close economic and cultural ties to the ocean. It would be very damaging to block access to the ocean with hard structures. As climate change is affecting these areas very significantly, it's hard to know how some of these nature-based strategies will perform. Okay. Hi participants, thank you for sending in your questions. That ends our Q&A portion. In the coming week, we'll be sending you a copy of the video presentation together with your certificate of attendance. We hope that you learned a lot from attending this session, and we hope that you will join us in future webinar seminars. Thank you very much.